She's crawling through snow, one boot missing, blood melting a thin trail behind her. Her breath comes in short, ripping gasps, each one colder than the last. Somewhere behind her, far enough to make it feel like a memory, but close enough to make her flinch, a door slams. The sound rolls down the frozen street like a gunshot. Her leg drags uselessly, bent where it shouldn't be. The bone pressing against skin, but not quite breaking through. The sharp pain comes in waves so fierce her vision flickers at the edges. The wool of her dress hangs in tatters, clinging to her thighs, where melted snow has turned to ice. Her hands, raw and split at the knuckles, sink into the snow, and each forward push leaves a print already filling with drifting white. The wind catches the hanging sign of the mercantile down the street, making it groan with each sway. Horses stand tied outside the saloon, steam curling from their nostrils, the sound of their shifting hooves swallowed by the wind. Somewhere in that building, men are laughing. The sound is warm, easy, and cruel, not because it mocks her, but because it doesn't even notice her. The smell of horses drifts over the cold, mixed with wood smoke, and the sharp tang of whiskey carried from a saloon door when it swings open for a moment. The glow from inside spills out onto the snow, a patch of gold on the ground, before the door closes again and swallows the light. She drops something as she pulls herself forward, a ring. Cheap, thin gold. It lands with a small, hollow sound on the frozen ground. She stares at it for a long heartbeat, her breath painting the air white. She doesn't pick it up. The snow beneath her smells faintly of iron now, her blood marking every place she's been. The hem of her dress is charred on one side, stiff and blackened as if it once caught a flame and was smothered in a hurry. The split in her lip is crusted, but fresh enough to ache every time the wind stings her face. She keeps moving, as if forward is the only direction left. Another door opens, this one from the general store, and a figure steps out. He pauses in the pale wash of lamplight. Broad shoulders fill his worn coat. The brim of his hat hides his eyes, but the stillness in his frame makes her feel seen. He leans a little against the hitching rail, his gloved hands resting lightly on the wood. He doesn't move toward her, doesn't call out, just watches. Her hands slip, and she goes down hard on her side, a whimper breaking loose before she can swallow it. She lies there, listening to the muffled thud of boots from somewhere behind her. The sound dies away. No one is coming to help. She forces herself upright again, teeth clenched so hard her jaw aches. The saloon's windows are fogged with heat and lamplight, silhouettes of men moving inside. A woman's laugh, high and practiced, cuts through the noise. It fades when the door swings closed again, leaving only the sound of the wind and her own ragged breaths. Snowflakes land on her lashes, clinging there until her blinking shakes them loose. Her vision blurs, but the dark outline of the man by the rail is still there. He hasn't stepped forward, hasn't turned away. The cold works into her bones in a way that feels permanent. Every movement now feels like it's happening through water, each drag of her leg heavier than the last. She doesn't know where she's going, only that stopping here would mean being found, or worse, forgotten. She thinks of fire, just a flash of it, the way the kitchen filled with smoke, the way he looked at her before he pushed her, his voice flat as he told her to get out. Then the sound, quick and brutal, when his boot came down on her leg. She remembers the way he stood over her afterward, the moment of stillness as if deciding whether to finish her or leave her. And then the door opening, the cold rushing in, the slam that still echoes in her ears. Her hands find the packed tracks of a wagon in the snow, and she pulls herself along them. The cold ruts give her something solid to grip. Each time she moves, her bootless foot drags over the ice, the toes numb and purple. The man by the rail shifts, the boards creaking under his weight. His face is shadowed, unreadable, but the wind catches the edge of his coat, making it billow slightly. He tips his head as if marking her distance, then lowers it again. She's nearly to the shadow of the livery when her arms give out. She falls forward, cheek pressed to the snow. The ground smells of hay and manure here, the scent cutting through the iron tang of her own blood. She tries to push herself up, but her arms shake too much to hold her. For a moment, she thinks she hears boots coming toward her, slow, deliberate, but when she looks up, There's nothing but drifting snow. Her breath comes in small, uneven bursts. She closes her eyes. Somewhere nearby, a horse shifts in its stall, the sound muffled but close. The warmth from inside the livery seeps faintly through the wall, just enough to make her shiver harder. The saloon's laughter is a distant hum now, the creak of the mercantile sign a steady heartbeat in the wind. She thinks she feels eyes on her again. She doesn't lift her head, doesn't open her eyes to check. The cold is a weight now, heavy and quiet. The snow falls harder, covering the thin gold ring she left behind. Somewhere in the dark, the man is still standing, waiting, watching, not moving. Not yet. The man worked with his head down, a hammer in one hand, the other steadying the rim of a wagon wheel propped against a barrel. Each strike rang dull in the winter air, softened by the snow that had drifted against the side of the mercantile. His gloves were worn through at the fingertips, showing skin roughened and cracked from years of rope, rains, and frost. His eyes, when he lifted them briefly to gauge the fit, were the color of a sky before a storm, cold, still, and holding more distance than the miles to the horizon. He heard her before he saw her, the faint scrape of fabric on frozen ground, the hitch of her breath, catching like something snagged on barbed wire. He didn't look right away. A man learned to listen longer than he looked in this town. Trouble had a way of pulling the curious straight into its teeth. When he did glance over, she was already halfway across the street, dragging herself through snow churned to gray slush, her leg bent wrong, her face pale beneath the dirt and cold. She was moving as if every inch between her and shelter was a mile of uphill road. The laughter spilling from the saloon doors carried over the wind, high, raucous, and careless. Two men standing by the trough muttered to each other, their words just loud enough to reach him. Ought to put her back where she belongs. Hell, looks like she crawled out of a coyote den. He didn't turn toward them. People in this town like their cruelty, without witnesses. They wouldn't throw a stone if they thought he might catch them at it. But their voices carried like they wanted her to hear every word. She stumbled and went down on one knee, the thin fabric of her dress sinking into the cold mud. No one moved to help. The church stood silent at the far end of the street, its doors shut against the wind. The rest of the buildings leaned in on themselves like they'd been watching scenes like this too long to care. He set the hammer down, wiped his hand on his coat, and stepped off the boardwalk. The snow crunched under his boots, loud enough to draw the eyes of a few who had been pretending not to watch. She didn't look up until he was almost to her. Her shawl lay twisted in the street, half sunk into a rut left by wagon wheels. He bent, picked it up, and shook the slush from it. Without a word, he draped it over her shoulders. Her fingers moved slightly, as if she meant to catch it, but her hands were too stiff to lift. He didn't meet her eyes, didn't speak, just turned and walked back to the wheel, the sound of his boots fading behind her. She stayed there a long moment, then began pulling herself forward again, each movement slow and labored. The wind pushed at her, tugging strands of hair from the loose knot at her neck. That night, the wind rose, pressing against the cabin walls with a low moan that worked its way into the seams of the place. He sat at the small table, a tin plate of beans in front of him. The lantern on the shelf threw a soft yellow circle across the table, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. He didn't eat, just sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the plate like the answer to something might be hiding in it. The fire in the stove had burned low. He stood to add more wood, the creak of the boards under his feet, the only sound besides the wind. When he closed the stove door, the sudden quiet felt heavier than before. He leaned against the wall for a long time, staring at the coals, his mind turning over the image of her dragging herself across the street. He thought of the last time he'd taken a side in something that wasn't his. The bruises had taken a month to fade. The debts from the damage still hadn't. This town had a way of punishing a man who got between someone and the hurt they were dealing out. But he also thought of the way she hadn't asked, the way she'd kept moving with no help and no hope of making it far. He'd seen that look in the war, men holding on to nothing but the ground beneath them and the will to keep it for one more breath. His ranch was barely holding on. The cattle were thin, the pasture frozen over, the roof leaking in 2 places. He owed more than he could pay by spring. Bringing trouble into the mix would be like setting fire to the last good fence post he had. Still, when the first thin light of morning slid over the horizon, he was already hitching the wagon. The cold bit hard at his fingers, but he worked quick, looping the leather through buckles, tightening straps, checking the wheels. His breath fogged in the air, curling away in the stillness. The road into town was a ribbon of frost. The ruts from yesterday hardened into ridges that jarred the wagon with each turn of the wheels. The sun was barely over the rooftops when he passed the saloon. A few early drinkers stood in the doorway, watching him go by with flat eyes. He found her in the stable behind the church. The smell of hay and old wood wrapped around the space, warmer than the street, but still cold enough to make breath visible. She was curled in the corner, her legs swollen and stiff, the shawl pulled up over her face. Her hair was loose now, tangled around her shoulders. She stirred when he stepped inside, blinking against the light from the open door. Her eyes tracked him as he crossed the dirt floor. He didn't speak, just knelt beside her, checking the leg with careful hands. She winced, her lips pressing into a tight line, but she didn't pull away. He stood, slipped his arms under her, and lifted her as if she weighed less than she did. Her breath hitched, not from the weight or the cold, but from the sudden shift out of the place she'd settled into. Outside, the morning was bright, the snow crisp underfoot. He carried her to the wagon, setting her gently among the folded blankets in the back. The horse stamped once, sending up a spray of frost, before the reins tightened and the wheels began to turn. The town was waking now. Faces appeared in windows. Doors opened just far enough for someone to watch him pass. No one called out. No one stepped forward. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, the cold wind cutting at his face, his hands steady on the reins. Behind him, she lay silent under the shawl, the rattle of the wagon wheels the only thing between them and the stillness of the plains. The road beyond town narrowed into two frozen tracks, the ruts biting into the wagon's wheels. Frost crackled under each turn, the sound steady as breathing. He kept the reins loose, letting the horse set its own pace. The wind cut through the open stretch of land, flattening the dry grass to brittle gold beneath the snow. Behind him, she lay still beneath the shawl, her breath clouding faintly in the cold air. The land rolled out wide and bare, the horizon sharp as a knife. Now and then, the wagon dipped into a shallow hollow where wind had piled the snow deep, slowing their progress. He didn't speak, didn't glance back. The quiet between them wasn't heavy. It was the kind that came when words wouldn't make sense of anything. By the time the cabin came into view, the sky had shifted toward evening, streaks of pale orange bleeding into the gray. The building stood alone against the expanse, its walls weathered to the color of ash. Smoke trailed from a pipe on the roof, thin and straight in the still air. The horse slowed without command, hooves crunching softer now as they neared the packed ground around the porch. He stepped down first, boots sinking slightly into the snow. Without a word, he came around to the back and lifted her into his arms again. She didn't resist, though her fingers gripped the edge of the shawl tight enough to whiten her knuckles. The porch boards creaked under their weight as he carried her inside. The heat from the stove was faint, barely enough to chase the edge off the cold. The place was small, one room, walls lined with shelves holding jars and tools, a bed tucked against the far wall beneath a patchwork quilt. A single chair sat at the table, its leg mended with twine and a wedge of pine. The stove's iron sides were cracked, patched with plate metal bolted in place. Everything in the room bore the same mark, used hard, repaired when it broke, kept until it couldn't serve any longer. He set her gently in the chair, the wood creaking under her weight. Then he moved to a low shelf and returned with strips of cloth and a piece of old fence rail cut to length. Kneeling before her, he eased her injured leg forward. She flinched but didn't pull away. "This'll hurt," he said quietly, the first words he'd spoken since lifting her from the stable. She only nodded, biting down on the inside of her cheek. His hands were steady as he worked, sliding the splint into place, wrapping the cloth tight. She drew in a sharp breath when he tied it off, but no sound escaped her. When it was done, he rose and crossed to the stove, stoking the fire with a practiced rhythm. The flames caught slowly, lighting his forearm in flickers. She saw the scars then, dark patches twisting up from his wrist to the elbow, the skin uneven, puckered. He didn't try to hide them. After a while, she said her name, just once, soft enough it almost got lost in the crackle of the stove. He didn't repeat it, didn't give her his own. He only nodded once, as if he'd set it somewhere in the back of his mind for later. The night settled in thick and quiet. The wind pressed against the walls, making them groan. He poured her a tin cup of water, set it within reach, then took his own seat at the edge of the bed. She sipped, eyes half closed, the steam from her breath mingling with the faint heat from the stove. In town, the talk had already started. The husband was still there, spending his nights in the saloon, telling anyone who'd listen how she'd run off, with some fool who don't know what's his. The words were repeated, twisted, passed along until they carried more weight than truth. A week passed before she could hobble with the crutch he'd fashioned from an old post. The days were slow, measured by the work he did outside, the steady thud of an axe, the scrape of a shovel breaking frost. She stayed indoors mostly, mending a tear in her dress with a thread he'd found in a jar, keeping the stove fed when he was gone. One afternoon, she stood at the window, watching him mend a section of fence near the edge of the property. The wind was sharp, carrying flecks of snow across the fields, but he worked without pause, his back bent, hands quick and sure. She watched until her breath fogged the glass. That night, when he came in and set his gloves by the stove, there was a small loaf of bread on the table. It was rough, unevenly baked, but the smell was warm and clean. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. She didn't meet his gaze, busying herself with folding the shawl over the back of the chair. He sat and broke the bread, leaving half on her plate, though she hadn't joined him at the table. No words passed between them. None were needed. The snow kept falling. The wind kept pressing at the cabin walls. But inside, the air held something that hadn't been there before, small, quiet, and steady, like a flame that didn't need tending to stay alive. The sound reached them before the shape did, hoofbeats pounding against the frozen ground, closing the distance with a steady, deliberate rhythm. She froze where she sat by the stove, her hand still on the edge of the shawl she'd been folding. The air in the cabin felt suddenly thin. He heard it too. He set down the piece of kindling he'd been splitting and straightened, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the window. Outside, the last light of day was fading, turning the snow to a pale silver sheen. The hoofbeat slowed, then stopped just beyond the porch. Silence pressed in for a heartbeat, broken only by the shifting of leather and the soft snort of a horse. She reached for the crutch leaning against the wall, fingers curling tight around the smooth wood he'd carved for her. A knock didn't come, just a heavy thud of boots on the porch, followed by the door swinging open without invitation. Cold air swept in, carrying the scent of whiskey and sweat. He filled the doorway like he owned it, broad shoulders blocking what little light remained outside. His hat was pushed back, shadowing a face marked with drink and arrogance. His voice was too loud for the small space, dripping with a mockery meant to sound casual. "Come on, girl," he said, grinning without warmth. "Time to quit playing house with this stranger and come back where you belong." She didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the crutch. The rancher stepped between them, his body casting a long shadow across the floorboards. He didn't speak, didn't so much as tilt his head toward the man in the doorway. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, eyes fixed straight ahead. The other man's grin faltered. "Ain't your fight," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier ease. "She's mine." The wind caught the door, making it creak against the frame. The cold swirled deeper into the room, carrying with it the faint jingle of the bit in the horse's mouth outside. The rancher didn't answer. He reached out, slow and steady, and took hold of the edge of the door. For a moment, he stood there, holding it halfway closed, his gaze locked on the man outside. Then he pushed. The door shut with a muted thud. The latch clicked into place. The hoofbeats started again, retreating into the distance until they faded entirely into the wind. She sat back, the crutch slipping slightly from her grasp to rest against her knee. The cabin was quiet except for the soft ticking of the stove as it settled. He moved past her without a word, set another log on the fire, and then sat down at the table. The night passed without talk. She lay awake long after the wind had eased, listening to the faint, steady sound of his breathing from the other side of the room. Morning came pale and soft, the snow outside beginning to sag in places where the first hints of warmth had touched it. They sat across from each other at the table, steam curling from 2 tin cups. Between them, in the center of the scarred wood, lay a thin gold ring. It wasn't on her hand anymore. He didn't touch it, didn't ask. She didn't explain. The wind rattled lightly at the window, carrying with it the smell of thawing earth, the first fragile promise of spring.